Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Within the Johnson edition, we are at poem now 286, That After Horror, That Twas Us. It is some interesting phrasing in the first line of the poem. This is a fascinating poem in a number of ways. In some ways, we're back to poem 160, Emily's near-death experience. We are, I think, in many ways back to poem 280. We will come back to study that one. There's an interesting backstory as well to this poem that we don't want to miss. The copy of this poem was sent to T.W. Higginson, a close pal, and it concludes with a letter written early in 1863 signed Barabbas, which of course will make sense because of our biblical studies and the crucifixion of Christ. And E.D. or Emily Dickinson will fancy that she owes an apology. This is all according to Johnson now. And she finishes that letter with, quote, "Might I be the one you tonight forgave? 'Tis a better honor. Mine is but just the thief's request." End quote. It makes this poem even that much more fascinating for us to read and study. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm really hopeful that you've already read the preceding 285 poems. We just finished with 285. The Robin is my criterion for tune. Now, the question of this poem is, really, what is it like to meet death? The scholar Vedler has commented that Emily likes to begin with a story of real life and end with a retelling that is in many ways an abstraction. And this poem will certainly, I think, give a classic example of this. In many ways, we're talking now about the soul's near-death and then the escape from that near-death experience. At least that's one reading of this. There's certainly a figurative reading of this poem that has nothing to do with an actual death, but rather we might call it a personal death, a social death, dare we say it, a spiritual death. Certainly I think this poem reads possibly that way as well. Either way, we're a hair's breadth of escape from the death experience. Notice we'll have three that's that we'll play with right away. That after horror, that 'twas us, that past the moldering pyre, just as the granite crumb let go, our Savior by a hair, a second more had dropped too deep for fishermen to plumb. The very profile of the thought puts recollection numb. The possibility to pass without a moment's bell into conjecture's presence is like a face of steel that suddenly looks into ours with a metallic grin, the cordiality of death, who drills his welcome in. Now, we've called this series Chats with Emily for a number of reasons. I mean, our reading of Whitman's, all of the deathbed edition, the 1892 deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, we called Talks with Walt. And our thinking in that series, and you can find that series at learnstrong.net, was that we would want to engage Whitman the way he engages a conversation with his soul. Song of Myself, Passage 5 immediately comes to mind, or Crossing Brooklyn Ferry comes to mind. There are many times that our study of Whitman will, in some ways, inform our study now of Emily Dickinson. And I think that this is one of those poems when it pretty easily happens. Notice at the very first line, it is us. And then 3 lines later in line 4, it is our Savior. Who specifically is this other that she is talking to? Many have seen it as she's talking to her soul. That is to say, we came this close to somehow death. Now, I said somehow because it's not completely clear what this death is. And as we start to kind of look into this poem, there's multiple interpretations of this. Notice, first of all, that after horror, you'll remember in poem 281, it was so over horror. That 'twas us. By the way, horror used in 10 poems, so this is a word that she likes. That whatever that experience was, that near-death experience, that was us. Now again, this takes us back to our study of Whitman and potentially the soul. That past the moldering pier, in other words, it's almost like walking out into the ocean and the pier is starting to molder, just as the granite crumble let go. Granite crumble is an amazing paradox, isn't it? And when we get to poem 997, I'll let you run it to ground. It's a fascinating use of the word crumbling. Just as the granite crumbling let go, and then it's our Savior, again, from us to our, and later it will be, suddenly looks into ours, our Savior by a hair, a second more, had dropped too deep. Remember in poem 284 where she said about how she dropped down and down, had dropped too deep. That phrase, too deep, is used once and only once in all of her poetry, and it's right here in this moment. Had dropped too deep for fishermen to plumb. Now, religious readers of this poem would immediately identify her use of the word fisherman, the fact that it's capitalized, taking us back to Matthew 4:19 and Christ's, I will make you fishers of men, fishermen of men. In other words, there seems to be a suggestion that she says, we almost fell and sunk down too deep for saving. In other words, Emily suggesting there was a moment when I almost became unsavable, but not quite. The very profile of the thought puts recollections numb. Now, so much, I think, of this poem can be better understood if we go back to poem 280 and we remind ourselves, I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, the service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again, then space began to toll. And as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and eye and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a whirl at every plunge, and finished knowing then. Now, in our conversations about this poem, again, conversations, chats with Emily, I commented on the fact that that poem does not necessarily have to be read as a horrific experience. Here it's a horror. It's possible that Emily is using the word horror, but using it in an ironic sense. This is not beyond her. And if that were the case, notice she'll say that even thinking about it makes me go numb. The word, again, from 280, of course, along with the word dropped. Then she'll say the possibility, and we've quoted this line from poem 696, the acres of possibility. I think, or perhaps, I'm sorry, the acres of perhaps. This use of the word possibility is similar. The possibility to pass without a moment's bell, of course, taking us back to 280 as well, into conjecture's presence, we're back to possibility, is like, and then there's this amazing simile, which again takes us back to the lead boots of 280. Then she says, is like a face of steel. Is it possible that we're back to Hamlet's skull of Yorick in Hamlet Act 5? I think there's a strong possibility of it. That suddenly looks into ours. Again, it's Hamlet looking into the face of Yorick and saying to his pal, Horatio, this was Yorick. I knew him as a boy. We've given full lectures on Hamlet at learnstrong.net. That suddenly looks into ours with a metallic grin. When we get to poem 1230, we'll play this game of metallic, and it'll read like this. It came at last, but prompter death had occupied the house, had his pallid furniture arranged, and his metallic peace. O faithful frost that kept the date, had love as punctual been, delight had aggrandized the gate and blocked the coming in. This idea of metallic, the idea that in death there's all this instrumentality that's a part of it, right? From working on the corpse to obviously the whole process of burial and everything. Metallic grin, and then the cordiality or the kindness of death. She'll use this word cordiality in the poem 986, 1661, and 1670. I'll let you guys run that to ground. That's the only other time. This cordiality of death is, to me, one of the most remarkable lines again. We'll think about maybe her most famous poem, 712, because I could not stop for death. He kindly, do you remember that use? He kindly stopped for me here. The cordiality of death, who drills his welcome in. You'll go back to poem 264 and that poem about torture and the instrumentation of torture and needles. And here it's the drill, the nails, if you will, his welcome capitalized in. What are we going to do with a poem like this at 2A? Well, I think one of the arguments is that coming so close to death, whether it be literal or figurative death, could be spiritual death, is horrifying, terrifying in some profound sense. At 2B, the word choice is remarkable. The metallic grin, the cordiality of death is quite remarkable as well. Now, at 3A, there are some who believe that Emily got some of these images from Keats's classic Ode to Indolence. It's possible she could have read this poem and therefore have played the game of the metallic grin. We mentioned Hamlet, Act 5. And then, of course, poem 712, because I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me. Finally, at 3B, what was a time when you, to own a poem like this, what was a time when you yourself felt unsavable? And what was that experience like? Thank you.